After a grueling week dealing with problems back in Chicago, I decided to take a break at my farmhouse in rural Wisconsin. I needed silence, fresh air, and the peace that only that place could give me. But when I pulled up to the driveway of the property, I saw something I never imagined I would see in my life. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, was carrying all the furniture out of the house. My son, Christopher, was loading every single thing into a moving truck. The sofa I bought with my first decent paycheck, the lamps I chose with so much love, the dining table where we had eaten together so many times. Everything was being hauled away as if none of it belonged to me. I did not expect such betrayal and audacity from them. During my 68 years of life, I had seen many things. I had gone through hard times, and I had faced loss and disappointment. But this was different. This was coming from my own blood, from the son I raised with my own 2 hands. I stood there by the gate, watching the scene. Christopher lifted a heavy box and arranged it in the back of the U-Haul. Jessica went in and out of the house as if she owned the place. Neither of them had seen me yet. They were so concentrated on their task, so sure of what they were doing, that they did not notice my presence. Without making a scene right there and then, I calmly took my smartphone out of my purse. My hands were trembling a little, but I managed to maintain my composure. Before saying anything, before confronting them, I needed to have proof of what I was seeing. I started recording everything in silence. The truck was big, one of those 26-footers used for full household moves. It was already half full of my belongings. I saw my chairs, my paintings, even the curtains I sewed myself years ago. Every object leaving that house represented years of effort, honest work, and sacrifice. Christopher stopped for a moment to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He was 42 years old. He was a strong and capable man. I had raised him alone after his father abandoned us when he was just 5 years old. I worked cleaning other people's houses. I did laundry. I scrubbed floors. I did everything necessary so that he would not lack anything. Jessica came out again with a box in her arms. She was 38 years old, and she always seemed like a calculating woman to me, cold in a certain way. But I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt because she was my son's wife, the mother of my grandchildren. Now I was seeing her with fresh eyes, collaborating in this brazen robbery. I kept recording everything from my position by the gate. The farmhouse was located in a quiet area of the countryside, surrounded by trees and with neighbors at a certain distance. It was my sanctuary, the place I bought with the savings of a lifetime of hard work. Every single dollar I invested in this property came from my sweat, from my tired hands, from my aching knees. My mind started working quickly despite the shock. I needed to understand what was really happening. Did they think I wouldn't come? Did they believe they could take everything without consequences? How long had they been planning this? Christopher went back into the house. I heard his voice from inside, talking to Jessica about what things were left to load. They were speaking naturally, without any apparent remorse. To them, this was just another task, a plan they were executing efficiently. I remembered the last time I spoke to Christopher on the phone, barely 3 days ago. He asked me how I was, if I needed anything, if the problems I had in the city had been resolved. He sounded worried, attentive, like a loving son. Now I understood that those questions had another purpose. He wanted to know when I would be away, how much time he would have to do this. Jessica appeared with more items. This time she was carrying my framed photographs, the ones that held memories of my whole life. The photo of my mother, who died 10 years ago. The photo of Christopher when he was a boy, smiling in his uniform on the first day of school. The photo of my late husband, taken months before he left us. I felt a deep pain in my chest, but I stood firm. I was not going to cry, not yet. I needed to be strong. I needed to think clearly. I put the phone back in my purse after getting enough video evidence. I took a deep breath and started walking toward them. My steps on the gravel driveway sounded soft. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows over the terrain. In the distance, birds could be heard singing, oblivious to the human drama unfolding at that moment. Nature followed its course, while my world was crumbling. When I was a few yards from the truck, Christopher finally saw me. His expression changed instantly. Surprise appeared on his face, followed quickly by something that looked like fear or guilt. He dropped the box he was carrying in his hands. The sound of the impact made Jessica come running out of the house. She saw me too, and froze in the doorway. Neither of them said anything for several seconds. I stared at them, a gaze that contained 68 years of experience, of overcome disappointments, of accumulated strength. Christopher was the first to try to speak. He opened his mouth, but the words did not come out easily. I raised my hand, asking for silence. It was not yet the time to hear his excuses or his lies. First, I needed to fully process what I was seeing, what all this meant. I walked slowly toward the truck and looked inside. There it was, everything. My entire life packed up like merchandise that someone could simply haul away. The furniture I chose with such care, the objects that accompanied me for years, the things that gave me comfort in my old age. Jessica took a step forward and started saying something about helping, about organizing, about doing me a favor. Her voice sounded nervous, artificial. I interrupted her with a single word that came firmly from my lips. Stop. Just that. Stop. Christopher tried to get closer to me. I saw in his eyes an attempt at manipulation, that expression he used since he was a child when he was caught doing something wrong. But I was no longer the mother who gave in to every excuse. The years had taught me to recognize the lie, to detect betrayal, even when it came wrapped in sweet words. I told him not to move, to stay exactly where he was. My voice sounded harder than I expected, firmer. It was the voice of a woman who had been pushed too far, who had trusted too much, and was now facing the consequences of that blind trust. To understand how I arrived at that horrible moment in front of my own house, watching my son rob me, I need to go back in time. I need to tell how my life was, how I built everything they were trying to take, how I came to have that farmhouse that represented the fruit of decades of sacrifice. I was born in a small town, in a humble family that barely had enough to eat. Since I was a girl, I learned that nothing in this life comes free, that everything is achieved with work and effort. My mother washed other people's clothes to support us, and my father worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. When I turned 18, I met James. He was a hard-working, honest man with dreams of progressing in life. We got married young, full of illusions and plans for the future. He got temporary jobs in construction, and I cleaned houses. We scraped together every dollar we could save. Christopher was born when I was 26. It was the happiest day of my life. I remember it perfectly, wrapped in a light blue blanket that a neighbor gave me. His small eyes looked at me with that innocence that newborns have. In that moment, I swore I would do everything possible to give him a better life than the one I had. James was happy too. He worked more hours. He accepted any extra job so that we wouldn't lack anything. The first years were difficult, but beautiful. We lived in a small apartment that we rented, but it was our home. Every night, we ate dinner together, talked about our dreams, planned the future. When Christopher was 5 years old, everything changed. James told me one morning that he had met another woman. Just like that, point blank, without preparation. He told me he was leaving, that he didn't feel the same for me anymore, that he needed to start over. He left that same afternoon, taking only a suitcase with his clothes. I was left alone with a small child, without money saved because James had taken everything we had in the bank account. That night I cried until I ran out of tears, but when the sun came up, I got up and kept going. I had no other option. Christopher needed me. I got a job cleaning offices at night. During the day I took care of Christopher and did sewing jobs that the neighbors commissioned. I slept 3 or 4 hours each night, but I never let my son go without. He always had food on the table, clean clothes, supplies for school. The years passed and Christopher grew. He was an intelligent, curious boy, affectionate with me. I worked tirelessly to pay for a good education. I wanted him to study, to have opportunities I never had, so he wouldn't have to scrub other people's floors to survive. When Christopher turned 15, I got a better job at a commercial cleaning company that paid more. I started saving with discipline. Every dollar I had left over after paying rent and food went into a special account. I had a dream, to buy my own property, a place no one could take from us. Christopher finished high school with good grades. I was proud of him. He got into a state university to study business administration. He worked part-time at a retail store while he studied, but I kept helping him with what I could. I paid part of his tuition, bought him books, made sure he didn't lack anything. During those years, he met Jessica. She was studying at the same university. She came from a family with more financial resources than us. At first, she seemed like a polite girl, although I always noticed a certain distance in her treatment of me. But my son was in love, and I wanted his happiness. They got married when Christopher was 25. I organized a modest reception with the money I had saved for my property. I didn't mind using those savings because I wanted my son to have a good memory of his wedding. Jessica complained that the celebration was too simple, but Christopher seemed happy. They continued living in an apartment they rented. I continued working hard, saving every possible dollar again. By then I was already 50 years old and my body was starting to feel the effects of so much effort. My knees hurt, my back protested every morning. But I didn't give up. When I was 55, I finally achieved my dream. I found the farmhouse in the country, a few hours from the city. It was a beautiful place, with trees all around, fresh air, silence. The house needed repairs, but the price was within what I had saved over so many years. I used all my savings for the down payment and took out a loan for the rest. For the next few years, I worked tirelessly to pay off that loan. Sometimes I did extra jobs on weekends, sacrificing my own needs so as not to fall behind on the monthly payments. Little by little, I furnished the farmhouse. Every piece of furniture I bought was chosen with care, thinking of comfort and durability. I couldn't afford to buy expensive things, but I looked for good quality objects that would stay with me for many years. Christopher and Jessica visited me occasionally. He seemed happy that I had my own place. Jessica made comments about how simple everything was, but I didn't pay attention to her. For me, that farmhouse represented the culmination of decades of effort, the prize for never having given up. When I turned 60, I finished paying off the loan. That day, I cried tears of happiness. The farmhouse was completely mine, debt-free, mortgage-free. No one could take it from me. Or so I believed at that moment, before knowing that betrayal would come from where I least expected it. The last few years I dedicated to improving the property. I planted fruit trees, fixed the roof, painted the walls. Every improvement was made, thinking of my future, of the place where I would spend my last years with tranquility and dignity. Christopher seemed to support my efforts. He called me often, asked how the improvements were going, told me he was happy to see me enjoying my own space. I trusted him completely. He was my son, the person for whom I had sacrificed my entire life. Jessica had 2 children, my grandchildren. I adored them and visited them whenever I could in the city. I brought them gifts, spent time with them, told them stories. I felt that finally all my effort had been worth it. I had my own home, a family, beautiful grandchildren. 6 months ago, Christopher started asking me about the deed to the farmhouse. He said it was important to have everything in order, that at my age I should make sure the papers were well kept. I didn't see any alarm bells in those questions. I thought it was genuine concern from a son for his mother. I showed him where I kept the documents, explained how everything was organized. He took photos of some papers, saying he wanted to have copies just in case. I trusted him without doubting for a second. The months following those conversations about the documents passed with apparent normality. I divided my time between the city, where I did some cleaning jobs to stay active and have extra income, and the farmhouse, where I spent weekends resting from the urban noise. My routine in the city was simple, but it kept me busy. I got up early, prepared my modest breakfast, and went out to work. I cleaned 2 small offices 3 times a week. The money wasn't much, but it was enough for my basic expenses and to treat myself occasionally with my grandkids. Every Friday afternoon, I took the bus upstate. The trip took almost 3 hours, but I didn't mind. I watched through the window as the city skyline faded behind and the landscape transformed into green fields, trees, and open sky. That journey was my transition between 2 worlds. Upon arriving at the farmhouse, I felt I could breathe deeply. The air was different there, cleaner, fresher. I opened the windows of the house and let the breeze enter, taking away the tiredness accumulated during the week. It was my sanctuary, my personal refuge. On Sunday afternoons, I returned to the city with a heavy heart, but also with renewed energy. That rhythm worked well for me. It kept me connected with my family, especially with my grandchildren. but I also had my space of peace where I could simply be myself. Christopher visited me in the city approximately every 2 weeks. He would arrive at my small apartment, sit at the kitchen table, and we would drink coffee together. We talked about his job, the kids, his plans. He worked at a logistics company. He had an administrative position that paid decently. During those visits, Christopher always asked me how I was, if I needed anything, if I had health problems. I appreciated his attention. I felt lucky to have a son who worried about me. I never imagined that behind those questions lay a hidden intention. Jessica rarely accompanied me in those meetings. She always had some excuse: the kids, work, social commitments. I didn't insist because I noticed she had never been truly comfortable with me. She came from another environment, had other customs, and I represented a humble past that perhaps embarrassed her. My grandchildren were my joy. Ethan was 8, and Lily was 6. When I saw them, I felt that all my effort had made sense. I bought them candy, told them stories of when their father was a boy, played with them. They called me Grandma Eleanor and ran to hug me every time I arrived. At the farmhouse, I kept everything spotless. I cleaned the house every weekend, watered the plants, tended the small garden I had created by the entrance. Every corner of that place had been worked on with my own hands. The curtains were sewn by me, the decorations chosen at local flea markets. Every detail had my personal stamp. The neighbors in the area were friendly, but we kept a certain distance. The nearest property was about 200 yards away. Margaret, who everyone called Peggy, lived there with her husband. She was my age, 65, and occasionally we exchanged greetings or a few words about the weather or the plants. I was never one to make deep friendships. My life had been too busy working and raising Christopher, but I appreciated the tranquility of knowing there were people nearby in case I needed help. Peggy had invited me a few times for coffee, but I always declined politely, preferring my solitude. 3 months ago, Christopher started visiting me at the farmhouse too. He would arrive without warning, generally when I was there on weekends. He said he wanted to spend time with me, that he missed the country air. I was happy to have him close, to share that space I loved so much. During those visits, he walked around the property as if he were evaluating it. He asked about the condition of the roof, the plumbing, how much each improvement had cost. I answered with pride, telling him how much I had invested in making that place a comfortable and safe home. Once I found him looking at documents in the small desk where I kept my important papers. He told me he was just looking for a pen, but I noticed some papers were in a different order. I didn't give it importance at that moment. He was my son. I trusted him completely. Jessica accompanied him once. She toured the house with a critical expression, making comments about how outdated the furniture was, about how small everything was. I felt a stab of pain in my chest, but I said nothing. I didn't want to create conflict with my son's wife. That afternoon, while I was making coffee for the 3 of us, I heard Jessica talking to Christopher in a low voice in the living room. I couldn't understand everything they were saying, but I caught some words: value, location, opportunity. I thought they were talking about some business of theirs, not related to me. The children came with me to the farmhouse only once. It was a beautiful day. They ran through the yard, played under the trees, got their knees dirty climbing and exploring. I watched them happily, imagining that perhaps one day they too would enjoy this place, that the farmhouse would pass to the next generations of our family. Christopher took many photos that day. Of the house, the land, every angle of the property. He said he wanted to have nice memories of that special place. I posed, smiling next to my grandkids, not knowing those photos would have a completely different purpose. 2 months ago, Christopher asked me to give him a copy of the keys to the farmhouse. He said it was for security, that if something happened to me or I had an emergency, he could get in to help me. It seemed like a reasonable request from a worried son. I gave him the keys without hesitation. A week after giving him the keys, Christopher mentioned that he had been to the farmhouse on a weekday to check that everything was okay. He said he had noticed a loose window and had secured it. I thanked him for worrying, for taking care of my property as if it were his too. What I didn't know then was that the visit hadn't been to help me. Peggy would tell me later that she saw a truck parked in front of my house that day, that she saw people coming and going, that she saw Christopher measuring walls and taking notes. But at that moment I knew nothing of that. My relationship with Christopher seemed closer than ever. We spoke on the phone almost every day. He asked about my health, my work, my plans. I told him everything, happy to have that connection with my son. I felt blessed that after so many years of sacrifice, we finally had a good relationship. Jessica started being nicer to me too. She called me occasionally, asked how I was, invited me to dinner at her house. I accepted those invitations with joy, thinking I had finally managed to earn her appreciation. How naive I was not to see the signs. The first real sign that something wasn't right came 6 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my city apartment resting after cleaning one of the offices. My phone rang, and it was an unknown number. I hesitated to answer, but finally did. It was a man who identified himself as an employee of a title company. He asked if I was Eleanor, owner of the farmhouse upstate. When I confirmed, he told me they needed to verify some data because there was a request for a transaction related to my property. He asked if I had initiated any legal process or transfer. I told him no, that I hadn't started any paperwork. The man fell silent for a moment and then told me it was strange because they had documents with my signature requesting a property appraisal for a possible sale. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't signed anything like that. I asked for more information, but he told me he needed to verify some details internally first and would call me back. He never called back. I tried to contact the title company using the number they called from, but no one answered. That night I couldn't sleep well, turning the matter over in my mind. The next day, I called Christopher to tell him about that strange call. He acted surprised and worried. He told me it was probably a scam, that there were many fraudsters trying to trick older people. He advised me to ignore calls from unknown numbers and that if it happened again, to call him immediately. His words calmed me down. What he said made sense. I had heard stories of scammers calling seniors pretending to be authorities or institution employees. I decided to follow his advice and forget the matter. But a part of me remained uneasy. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected visit at my apartment. It was a man of about 50, well-dressed, who introduced himself as a representative of a real estate firm. He told me they were interested in buying properties in the area where my farmhouse was and wanted to make me an offer. I told him clearly that my farmhouse was not for sale, that it was my home and I had no intention of selling it. The man insisted. He told me they had a very interested client willing to pay a good price. He showed me papers with figures. He talked about hundreds of thousands of dollars that sounded tempting, but I stood firm. I asked him to leave and told him not to bother me again. Before leaving, he looked at me with a strange expression and said something that stuck with me. His client had already made previous investments related to that property and hoped to finalize the purchase soon. I didn't understand what he meant by that. That night, I called Christopher again. I told him about the visit from the real estate man. This time, I noticed something different in his voice. He took a few seconds to respond, and when he did, his tone sounded tense. He told me it was very weird, that surely someone was trying to take advantage of me. He suggested that, for security, it would be good for him to review all my property documents. He said he wanted to ensure everything was in order, that there were no irregularities that could be exploited by unscrupulous people. I agreed, seeing no reason to distrust. The following weekend, Christopher came to the farmhouse. I was there as always. He arrived alone, without Jessica or the kids. He brought a large folder and asked for all documents related to the property. He sat at the dining table and started reviewing every paper with attention. I prepared lunch while he worked. From time to time, I looked at him from the kitchen and saw him concentrated, taking notes in a notebook, making brief phone calls. I felt calm having him there, thinking my son was protecting my interests. After lunch, Christopher told me that everything seemed to be in order, but he had noticed that some documents needed updating. He talked about changes in zoning laws, new legal requirements, the importance of having everything perfectly registered. I didn't understand much of those things, so I trusted his judgment. He asked for permission to take some original documents to the city. He said a lawyer acquaintance of his could review them and ensure everything was in compliance with the new regulations. I gave him permission. He was my son, the man I had raised, the person I trusted most in this world. A week later, Christopher brought the documents back. He explained that the lawyer had made some minor corrections, that everything was perfect now. He showed me papers with official stamps, with signatures I didn't recognize. He told me they were necessary certifications, registry updates. I signed where he indicated. I signed without reading completely, without understanding all the legal terms, trusting that my son would never hurt me. Those signatures I put that day, on documents I didn't fully understand, would be used later in ways I never imagined. The following week, Christopher was more present than ever. He visited me constantly, called me every day, showed himself extremely attentive. I was happy with that closeness, feeling that I finally had the loving son I had always dreamed of having. Jessica also changed her attitude. She invited me to her house, cooked for me, included me in family plans. The kids spent more time with me. I felt part of a united family, something I had yearned for years. I didn't see that all that sudden affection had a calculated purpose. A month ago, Christopher proposed something that, at the time, seemed like one more show of his affection. He told me he had spoken with Jessica, and they had decided that I shouldn't continue working cleaning offices at my age. They wanted me to retire completely and enjoy my last years without worries. He explained that they could help me financially if necessary, that I shouldn't keep wearing down my health for a few dollars. I got emotional with his proposal. I felt valued, cared for, loved. I accepted his suggestion and left my cleaning jobs. With more free time, I started spending more days at the farmhouse. Not just weekends anymore, but also some weekdays. I enjoyed the tranquility, the garden, my plants. I felt at peace, never imagining that peace was about to be broken in the most brutal way. 3 weeks ago, I decided to go to the farmhouse on a Wednesday. Generally, I went on Fridays, but that particular day, I felt tired of the city noise and wanted to advance my trip. I took the bus early in the morning. I arrived before noon. When I was walking from where the bus dropped me off to my property, I saw a car parked near my gate. I didn't recognize it. It struck me as odd, because normally there were no vehicles in that area midweek. I walked slower, with certain caution. Upon getting closer, I saw it was a rental car, the kind enterprise companies use. No one was inside. I looked toward my house and noticed the door was ajar. My heart started beating faster. Someone was inside my house without my permission. I entered silently. I heard voices inside. One was Christopher's voice. The other I didn't recognize. They were talking in the living room, discussing measurements, spaces, remodeling possibilities. I stayed hidden in the hallway, listening. The man accompanying Christopher spoke with enthusiasm about the potential of the property. He said that with some renovations, the place could sell for an excellent price. He mentioned specific figures, $400,000, maybe $450,000 if the right improvements were made. My blood froze hearing those words. Christopher responded with tranquility, as if he were discussing something completely normal. He was telling the man that he had already spoken with some contacts about potential buyers, that the legal process was practically resolved, that only some final details were missing. He spoke of my property as if it were already his. I came out of my hiding place in the hallway. The two men froze upon seeing me. Christopher's face lost all color. The other man, who was carrying a briefcase and a folder with blueprints, looked at me confused. There was a heavy silence that seemed to last an eternity. I asked Christopher what all that meant. My voice came out shaky but firm. He tried to smile. He tried to act naturally. He told me it was a surprise, that he was evaluating options to help me, that he had thought maybe I would want to sell the farmhouse and move to a place closer to them in the city. I told him I had never mentioned wanting to sell, that this farmhouse was my home, my refuge, the result of decades of work. Christopher continued with his excuses. He said he was just exploring possibilities, that he wanted to know how much the property was worth in case I changed my mind someday. His words sounded hollow, false. The other man quickly introduced himself as a real estate appraiser. He extended his business card with nervous hands. He said Christopher had contacted him for an informal evaluation, that there was nothing official yet, that they were just looking at options. I didn't believe a word. I asked them both to leave my house immediately. The appraiser gathered his things hurriedly and practically ran to his car. Christopher stayed, trying to talk to me, but I didn't want to listen. I told him I needed to be alone, that he had disappointed me deeply. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, looking at the walls I had painted with my own hands, the furniture I had bought with so much sacrifice. I was trying to understand what was really happening. My son, my only son, was planning something behind my back. The next day, I returned to the city. I needed to think. I needed to understand the magnitude of what I had discovered. Christopher called me several times, but I didn't answer. Jessica also tried to communicate with me. I let all calls go to voicemail. During the following days, I started remembering details that previously seemed insignificant. The constant questions about the documents, the sudden interest in spending time with me, the frequent visits to the farmhouse. Everything started making sense, forming a pattern that terrified me. I decided to go talk to Peggy, my neighbor at the farmhouse. I took the bus and went directly to her house. She received me with surprise, but kindly. I asked her if she had seen anything strange on my property during the last few weeks, especially when I wasn't there. Peggy hesitated a moment before answering. Finally, she told me yes, that she had seen Christopher arrive several times during the week, with different people. She saw cars parked, people entering and leaving, even a construction company truck once. She had thought I was aware of all that. She also told me that 2 weeks ago she saw Christopher and Jessica measuring the exterior land. That she heard Jessica talking on the phone about planning a complete remodel. Peggy thought maybe I had decided to make improvements to the property with my family's help. She never imagined I knew nothing. I thanked her for her honesty and asked her that if she saw anything else, to let me know immediately. She gave me her phone number and told me I could count on her for whatever I needed. She looked at me with pity and concern, as if she understood what was happening without me having to explain it. I returned to my apartment in the city with a broken heart. The betrayal was worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just a passing idea of Christopher's. It was an elaborate plan that had been in motion for months. He had taken the time to bring appraisers, to plan renovations, to look for buyers. That afternoon, I finally answered one of Christopher's calls. His voice sounded anxious. He asked for forgiveness. He told me he had handled everything wrong, that his intentions were good. He tried to explain that he only wanted to secure my future, that he thought selling the farmhouse and having the money in the bank would be better for me at my age. I asked him directly if he had done anything with the documents I gave him. There was a long silence. Then he told me he had updated some records, as he had explained, that everything was legal. But his tone of voice told me there was something else, something he wasn't telling me. I demanded he return all my original documents. He told me he had them kept in a safe place, that he could bring them to me whenever I wanted. I told him I wanted them back immediately. We agreed to meet the next day at my apartment. Christopher arrived the next afternoon. He brought a folder with documents. He handed them to me in silence. I reviewed them one by one, but the truth is, I didn't completely understand what I was looking at. They were papers full of legal terms, stamps, signatures. Some looked different from how I remembered them. I asked him to leave. Before leaving, he tried to hug me, but I pulled away. I saw tears in his eyes, but they didn't move me. He had lost my trust. He had broken something that perhaps could never be repaired. I closed the door behind him and stayed alone with the documents. During the next few days, I tried to understand the papers. There was one in particular that worried me. It was an authorization document I had signed a power of attorney, but reading it more carefully, I realized it gave very broad permissions. Permissions to conduct business, to represent me in legal matters, to make decisions about the property. I vaguely remembered signing that paper. Christopher had told me it was just a formality, an update required by changes in the laws. I had trusted his word. Now I saw that document could be used in ways I never imagined. I decided to seek professional help. I needed to know exactly what all those papers I had authorized without realizing meant. I searched the internet for lawyers who offered free or affordable consultations. I found a firm that had services for people with low income. I called and asked for an appointment. They gave me a slot for the following week. While waiting for that date, I kept turning everything over in my head. The days felt eternal. I couldn't sleep well. I had no appetite. Anguish consumed me thinking about what else I might discover. Christopher tried to visit me several times, but I didn't open the door. Jessica came once and knocked insistently. She yelled from outside that they needed to talk to me, that it was all a misunderstanding. I stayed silent inside my apartment until she left. The kids sent me drawings by mail. Ethan wrote a note saying he missed me. Lily drew a house with flowers and put my name at the bottom. Those gestures broke my heart. I loved my grandchildren deeply, but their parents were trying to destroy my life. Finally, the day of the appointment with the lawyer arrived. His name was Robert Sullivan, but he said to call him Bob. He had a small but organized office. He was a man of about 55, serious-looking but kind. He offered me coffee and asked me to tell him my situation. I told Robert Sullivan the whole story. From the beginning, from the strange calls from the title company, passing through the visit of the appraiser, to finding Christopher with the evaluator at my farmhouse. I showed him all the documents I had. He reviewed them with attention, taking notes, asking specific questions about dates and circumstances. As I spoke, I could see his expression turning more serious. When I finished telling him everything, he took a deep breath and looked at me with a mixture of compassion and concern. He told me the situation was delicate, that there were signs they might be preparing a real estate fraud. Bob explained that the authorization document I had signed gave Christopher very broad powers over my property. With that paper, that power of attorney, he could conduct business in my name, even initiate sale processes if he combined it with other documents. He told me it was common for unscrupulous people to use this type of authorization to strip older adults of their assets. I felt the floor moving under my feet. I asked if it was possible that Christopher was really planning to take my farmhouse from me. Bob told me that, based on what I had told him and the documents he had reviewed, it was a very real possibility. He advised me to act quickly to protect my assets. He explained that we needed to revoke that power of attorney immediately. He also suggested we register a fraud alert or a lis pendens on the property title, indicating that I, as the owner, did not authorize any transaction without my physical presence and my signature before a notary public. This would make any attempt at fraudulent sale extremely difficult. I asked him how much his services would cost. I had some savings, but not much. Bob looked at me kindly and told me this type of case outraged him deeply. He offered to charge me a minimal fee, barely enough to cover the filing expenses, $500 for the whole process. I accepted gratefully. We signed a simple legal services agreement. He told me he would start working immediately on the revocation of the power and the registration of the fraud alert. He asked me not to say anything to Christopher yet about this legal consultation. It was important that he didn't know I was taking measures. Bob also suggested I try to get more information about what exactly Christopher had been doing. He recommended talking to neighbors, checking if there were other documents I didn't know about, being attentive to any suspicious movement. He gave me his personal number and told me to call him at any hour if I discovered something important. I left that office feeling a little stronger. For the first time in weeks, I felt I wasn't completely alone, that there was someone on my side who understood the gravity of the situation. I had a plan of action, concrete steps to follow to protect myself. The following days were of silent work. Bob kept me informed about the progress. The revocation of the power was processed quickly. The fraud alert on the property registry took a little more time, but finally, it was also completed. Legally, it was now much more difficult for anyone to do anything with my farmhouse without my knowledge. Meanwhile, I started investigating on my own. I went back to speak with Peggy. I explained more openly what was happening. She showed solidarity and told me more details she had observed. She told me once she saw Jessica taking photographs of the entire property, even the interior of the house. Peggy also mentioned she heard Christopher talking on the phone in the yard of my farmhouse about 3 weeks ago. He was talking about deadlines, about cutoff dates, about having everything ready before I noticed. Those words confirmed there was a concrete plan with established times. I asked Peggy that if she saw anything suspicious again, to document it, to take photos if possible, to write down dates and times. She agreed to help me. She told me we were older women and we had to look out for each other. I felt grateful to have at least one ally in this horrible situation. Christopher kept calling me. I answered occasionally so as not to raise suspicions, but kept conversations brief. He insisted we see each other, that we talk calmly. He told me he missed me, that the kids missed me. He used every emotional resource he knew to soften me. Jessica also intensified her contact attempts. She sent me long text messages talking about misunderstandings, about the importance of family. She told me Christopher only wanted the best for me, that I was interpreting everything wrong. Her words were full of manipulation, trying to make me doubt my own perception. One afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. It was a woman who identified herself as an employee of a moving company. She asked if I confirmed the service scheduled for the following week. I told her I hadn't requested any moving service. She was confused and read me an address. It was the address of my farmhouse. I asked for more details. She told me they had an order signed by Christopher requesting to remove furniture and household goods from that address. The scheduled date was 5 days from now. I told her firmly to cancel that service, that it was a mistake, that no one had authorization to move anything from that property. The woman told me she needed to speak with the person who made the reservation because a deposit had already been paid. She gave me the contact number they had on file. It was Christopher's phone number. I hung up the call, and my whole body started to shake. The plan was more advanced than I thought. I called Bob immediately. I told him about the call from the moving company. He was alarmed and told me this confirmed his worst suspicions. He advised me to go to the farmhouse as soon as possible and stay there. Not to leave it alone for a moment until we completely resolved the legal situation. He also suggested I report this to the police as an attempted dispossession. He explained that although Christopher was my son, what he was doing constituted a crime. I hesitated about involving the authorities. He was my son, despite everything. Bob told me firmly that being family didn't give him the right to rob me. That night I packed a small suitcase and prepared to go to the farmhouse the next day and stay there as long as necessary. I wasn't going to let them take what had cost me a lifetime to achieve. For the first time in weeks, I felt something resembling determination. Before going to sleep, I reviewed all the documents I had again. I searched through my old papers and found receipts for all the payments I had made for the farmhouse over the years. The receipts for the initial loan, the invoices for improvements, the proof of taxes paid. Everything was in my name. Everything proved that property was mine. I prepared a binder with all that documentation. I kept it together with the papers Bob had given me about the revocation of the power and the fraud alert. That binder was my shield, my legal protection against any attempt to strip me of what was mine. The next morning I took the bus upstate. During the trip, my mind wouldn't stop working. I thought about all the years I had dedicated to raising Christopher, about the sacrifices I had made for him. I remembered the sleepless nights when he was a baby, the extra jobs to pay for his tuition, the times I went hungry so he would have food. I wondered at what moment everything had gone wrong. At what moment had my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to getting money? The answer probably had to do with Jessica, with her ambitions, with her way of valuing things only for their material price. I arrived at the farmhouse at noon. Everything seemed quiet. I unlocked the door and entered. I checked every room looking for signs that someone had been there. Everything seemed to be in its place, but I noticed small details, different. A drawer I always left completely closed was slightly open. Some photos on the shelf were in a different order. I sat on the living room sofa and looked around. Every object in that house had a story. The lamp on the side table I bought at a flea market 15 years ago, haggling the price for half an hour until getting a $10 discount. The curtains I sewed during an entire winter, taking advantage of free afternoons after work. I decided to look deeper. I went to the desk where I kept important documents. I opened all the drawers methodically. In the back of the last drawer, under some old bills, I found something that froze my blood. It was a copy of a purchase agreement, a contract where my farmhouse was being sold for the sum of $350,000. The document was dated 2 weeks ago. In the seller section appeared my name, with a signature that looked like mine, but that I didn't remember putting there. In the buyer section was a name I didn't know, a company with a generic LLC name. The signing witnesses were Christopher and Jessica. My hands shook while holding that paper. This was the full plan. They didn't just want to evaluate the property or think about selling it in the future. They had already prepared a sales contract. They had already forged my signature. They already had a fictitious buyer, probably someone working with them to make the transaction look legitimate. I took photographs of the document with my phone. I called Bob immediately. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I had found. I heard his agitated breathing on the other end of the line. He told me that was evidence of document fraud, which was a serious felony. He asked me not to touch that document, to leave it exactly where I found it. Bob explained that we needed to act with great caution. He said that contract probably hadn't been executed yet because the fraud alert we registered had blocked it. When they tried to do the final paperwork at the county recorder's office, they must have encountered the warning we had placed. That explained why they had scheduled the move. If they couldn't sell the property legally because I had blocked the registry, their alternative plan was simply to empty the house and take physical possession of the place. Once they had control of the real estate, it would be harder for me to recover it, especially if they destroyed or hid the documents proving my ownership. Bob told me that now it was absolutely necessary to file a formal police report. He explained that with that fake contract as evidence, we had sufficient proof of attempted fraud. He gave me precise instructions on how to proceed. He told me not to move from the farmhouse, that he would come personally the next day with a police officer. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every noise startled me. Every shadow I saw through the window made me fear it was Christopher and Jessica arriving to confront me. I deadbolted all the doors. I checked the windows. I stayed awake on the sofa with all the lights on. I thought a lot that night. I thought about how I had reached this point. A 68-year-old woman, alone in her house, fearing her own son. I wondered if I had been a bad mother, if I had made mistakes so grave that they had turned Christopher into someone capable of doing this to me. But then I remembered all the values I tried to teach him: honesty, respect, gratitude. I taught him by example, working honestly all my life, never taking what wasn't mine, treating everyone with dignity. If he had chosen to ignore those teachings, that responsibility was his, not mine. At dawn, I heard a car approaching. My heart raced. I looked out the window and saw it was Peggy in her old pickup truck. She got out with a basket in her hands. I knocked on the door from inside and opened it. She had brought fresh bread, coffee, and fruit. She said she imagined I hadn't slept well and wanted to make sure I had something for breakfast. We sat in the kitchen, and I told her about the fake contract I had found. Peggy shook her head with sadness. She told me she had seen so many similar cases in her life: children taking advantage of older parents, seeing them as sources of money instead of people deserving respect and care. She asked if I was afraid of what would come next. I told her the truth. Yes, I was afraid. Afraid of confronting my son publicly, afraid of losing contact with my grandchildren, afraid of ending up completely alone. But I was more afraid of being left with nothing, without a home, without dignity, after a lifetime of honest work. Peggy took my hands across the table. She told me she would be with me for whatever I needed, that she wouldn't leave me alone in this process. She told me she too had gone through difficult situations with her family, that she understood how painful it was when those who should protect you are the ones who hurt you. Around 10 in the morning, Bob arrived, accompanied by a police officer. The officer was a man of about 40, looking professional. Bob made the formal introductions. The officer asked me to tell him the whole story from the beginning. I sat with them in the living room and narrated every detail again. I showed the fake contract I had found. The officer examined it with attention, took photographs, put it in an evidence bag. He asked me specific questions about the signatures, about when I supposedly signed it, about whether I recognized the witnesses. I answered every question with as much precision as possible. The officer explained that this constituted forgery and attempted grand larceny. He told me they could open a formal investigation, but I had to be prepared for the consequences. It meant Christopher would be questioned, possibly face criminal charges. I told him I understood that, despite the pain it caused me, I needed to protect what was mine. Bob intervened, explaining all the preventive measures we had taken. The officer nodded approvingly. He said we had acted correctly by registering the fraud alert, that this had probably prevented the fraud from being completed. He congratulated me for seeking legal help in time. After taking my formal statement, the officer told me the moving company that had been hired would also be contacted. They would have to testify about who made the reservation and would provide related documents. All that would serve as additional evidence of the plan Christopher and Jessica had elaborated. Before leaving, the officer gave me some security recommendations. He suggested changing the locks on the house immediately, since Christopher had copies of the keys. He told me to document everything, to take photographs of my belongings, to keep a log of any attempt at contact or intimidation. Bob stayed a while longer after the officer left. He explained the next steps of the legal process. There would be an investigation that could take a few weeks. During that time, I had to stay firm, not let myself be convinced by Christopher if he tried to manipulate me emotionally. He reminded me that what he had done was serious, criminal, not just a family mistake. That afternoon, I hired a local locksmith Peggy recommended. He came and rekeyed all the locks on the house. He gave me 3 sets of new keys. I kept one with me, gave another to Peggy in case I needed help in an emergency, and the third I kept in a safe place inside the house. While the locksmith worked, I received calls from Christopher. I didn't answer. Messages from Jessica also arrived. I read them, but didn't respond. They said they were worried because they couldn't reach me, that they needed to speak urgently. I knew they had probably tried to come to the farmhouse and found their keys no longer worked. At night, Peggy insisted I sleep at her house. She said it wasn't good for me to be alone yet, that the next day I could return to my farmhouse with more peace of mind. I accepted her offer, gratefully. I needed the comfort of not being completely alone at that moment. At Peggy's house, while we ate hot soup she prepared, she told me about her own life. She spoke of the difficulties she had faced, of the losses, of the betrayals. She told me life had taught her that true strength comes not from never falling, but from getting up every time we fall. The next morning, I returned to my farmhouse early. I needed to be there, to feel I was regaining control of my space. Peggy accompanied me and stayed with me during the morning. We made coffee and sat on the porch, looking at the garden I had cultivated with so much love for years. Around noon, we heard the sound of an engine approaching. It was a large truck, exactly as the woman from the moving company had described. Behind it came Christopher's car. My heart started beating hard, but I stayed firm. Peggy squeezed my hand in a sign of support. Christopher got out of the car first. Jessica came out of the passenger side. Both walked toward the gate of my property with a determined expression. That was when they saw me and Peggy sitting on the porch. The surprise on their faces was evident. Clearly, they didn't expect to find me there. Christopher tried to smile, tried to act naturally. He called me with a voice pretending to sound affectionate, but I could detect the tension behind every word. He told me he had come to help me with some things around the house, that he had hired the truck to move furniture that needed repair. I stood up slowly. I walked toward the gate, but I didn't open it. I looked both of them directly in the eyes and told them I knew exactly what they had been planning. I took out my phone and showed them the photograph of the fake sales contract I had found. I saw the color disappear from their faces. Jessica was the first to react. She started yelling that I was misunderstanding everything, that the document was just a draft, that they never intended to execute it without my consent. Her words came out rushed, desperate. Christopher tried to calm her, but she continued with her increasingly elaborate excuses. I told Christopher that I had spoken with a lawyer and the police, that there was sufficient evidence of document forgery and attempted fraud, that everything was being formally investigated. I saw real panic in his eyes for the first time. He tried to get closer to the gate, but I took a step back. The drivers of the moving truck got out of their vehicle, confused by the scene unfolding. One of them asked if they should start loading. I told them with a clear and strong voice that they did not have my authorization to take anything from my property, that if they touched anything, they would be participating in a robbery. Christopher tried to speak with the truck workers, but Peggy intervened. She approached the gate and told the men she was a witness, that the owner of the property had not authorized any moving service, that the best thing they could do was leave before getting involved in legal problems. The workers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. One of them took out a paper and told Christopher they needed a clear resolution because they didn't want trouble. Christopher tried to convince them it was all a family misunderstanding, but the men were already climbing back into the truck. Jessica started screaming louder. She accused me of being an ungrateful old woman, of not valuing everything they had done for me. She said the farmhouse was too much for me alone, that at my age I couldn't maintain it, that they only wanted the best for me. Every word she said revealed her true nature. The mask of kindness had fallen completely. At that moment, another car arrived. It was Bob, my lawyer. He got out with a briefcase under his arm and walked toward us with a serious expression. He introduced himself formally to Christopher and Jessica as my legal representative. He informed them there was a criminal investigation in progress, and that any attempt at intimidation or accessing the property without authorization would be reported immediately to the authorities. Christopher tried to talk to Bob. He tried to explain his version of events. Bob interrupted him with a firm voice. He told him it wasn't appropriate for them to speak at that moment, that if he had anything to say, he should do it through his own lawyer during the official investigation. He handed him his business card so he would have the contact details. Jessica kept yelling, but now her shouts were more about money. She said they had invested time and resources in planning improvements for the property, that they had spent money on evaluations and paperwork, that I owed them compensation for those expenses. Her greed was exposed with every word. Bob took some documents out of his briefcase. He showed Christopher the official revocation of the power of attorney I had signed previously. He also showed him the registration of the fraud alert on the property. He explained that any document he had in his possession related to the farmhouse no longer had legal validity, that I had taken all necessary measures to protect my assets. The moving truck left at that moment, leaving Christopher and Jessica alone in front of my gate. Christopher tried one last time to speak with me directly. His voice now sounded different, pleading. He told me he was his mother, that I couldn't do this to him, that I should think of my grandchildren, of the family. I felt a stab of pain in my heart hearing my grandchildren mentioned. I missed them terribly, but I remained firm. I told Christopher that he had decided to betray me, that he had planned to steal from me what cost me a lifetime to achieve, that the consequences of his actions were his responsibility, not mine. Jessica tried to get closer, pushing on the gate, but Peggy stepped in. She told her with a calm but firm voice to leave the property immediately, that there were witnesses to everything that was happening, that every word they said could be used against them during the investigation. At that moment, a police cruiser arrived. The officer who had taken my statement the previous day got out of the vehicle. He approached the group and asked if there was a problem. Bob explained the situation briefly. The officer looked at Christopher and Jessica and asked them to identify themselves. Christopher took out his ID with trembling hands. The officer checked his identity and took note of his details. He asked him what he was doing there with a moving truck. Christopher tried to explain it had been a misunderstanding, that he only wanted to help his mother. The officer interrupted him and told him he was already aware of the ongoing investigation. The officer formally warned Christopher and Jessica that they should not approach the property again without explicit authorization from the owner, that any violation of this warning would result in immediate arrest. He told them they needed to leave the premises right then. Christopher nodded in silence, defeated. Before leaving, Christopher looked at me one last time. There were tears in his eyes, but I didn't know if they were of genuine regret or simply frustration at having been caught. I wanted to believe there was something left of the boy I raised, but that boy seemed to have disappeared a long time ago. Jessica got into the car, furious, slamming the door. She shouted something from inside that I didn't quite hear. Christopher walked slowly to the car. He got in and started it. I watched them drive away down the dirt road until they disappeared among the trees. The silence that followed was deep. I stood by the gate, feeling all the accumulated tension starting to release from my body. My legs were shaking. Peggy held me by the arm and helped me walk back to the porch. I sat in the same chair where I had been before, but now I felt completely different. The officer approached and asked if I was okay. I told him yes, that I was in shock but okay. He reminded me that I should call him if Christopher or Jessica tried to contact me again or approach the property. He told me the case remained under investigation and that I would probably have to give a statement again in a few days. Bob sat next to me. He explained that what had just happened was very important, that we had witnesses, including the police officer, that Christopher had arrived with a moving truck trying to take my belongings without authorization, that this enormously strengthened the case of attempted dispossession. The following days were strange. On one hand, I felt enormous relief for having faced the situation, for having protected what was mine. On the other hand, the pain of family betrayal accompanied me at every moment. I spent the nights at my farmhouse, now really feeling it as my safe refuge. Peggy became a true friend during that time. She came to visit me every day. We shared coffee, talked about life. She told me stories of her youth, of the difficulties she had faced. I also shared with her memories I had kept for years. That friendship that blossomed in the midst of the crisis was an unexpected gift. Bob kept me informed about the progress of the investigation. The police had questioned Christopher and Jessica. They had also spoken with the moving company, with the appraiser who was at my house, with the title company where they tried to register the fake contract. Every testimony confirmed the plan they had elaborated to strip me of my property. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the gate, Bob summoned me to his office. He told me there was important news. The district attorney's office had decided to proceed formally with charges against Christopher and Jessica for forgery and attempted grand larceny. They faced the possibility of prison sentences if declared guilty. He asked me how I felt about it. I told him the truth. I felt devastated, but also liberated. Devastated because he was my son, because I had dreamed of an old age surrounded by a loving family. Liberated because finally I had set boundaries. I had defended my dignity. I had said enough. Bob explained there was a possibility of reaching a plea deal before going to trial. If Christopher and Jessica accepted their guilt, returned any document they had, signed a legal commitment not to approach me or my property, and compensated me for legal expenses, the DA might consider lesser penalties or probation instead of prison. He asked if I would be willing to consider that option. I thought for several minutes before answering. I told him yes, that despite everything, I didn't want to see my son in prison. But I had conditions. I wanted them to admit publicly what they had done. I wanted my grandchildren to know the truth when they were older. And I wanted the absolute guarantee that they would never try anything similar again. The negotiations took several more weeks. Christopher and Jessica's lawyer tried to minimize the facts, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Finally, they reached an agreement. They admitted their guilt, committed to staying away, and compensated me with $3,000 for legal expenses and damages. Part of the agreement included Christopher writing a letter explaining his actions. When I received that letter, I sat on my porch and read it with tears running down my cheeks. He admitted he had been blinded by greed, influenced by Jessica, pressured by debts I didn't know about. He asked for forgiveness, although he acknowledged he didn't deserve to be forgiven. I didn't answer that letter. I wasn't ready yet. The pain was too recent, too deep. I kept the letter in a drawer, thinking that perhaps one day I could read it without feeling it pierced my heart, but that day hadn't arrived yet. The months passed. I dedicated myself to healing, to rebuilding my life. Peggy and I became inseparable. She taught me to knit, something I had never had time to learn. I taught her my cooking recipes, the ones I had perfected over decades. We accompanied each other in the loneliness we both shared. I started participating in local community activities. There was a group of older women who met on Tuesdays at the church in the nearby town. I went once out of curiosity and found a group of strong ladies. You knew they had been through their own battles. They accepted me immediately. They made me feel part of something bigger. One of those women, Barbara, had a story similar to mine. Her daughter had tried to declare her mentally incompetent to take control of her finances. Another, Susan, had been stripped of her house by a nephew, but managed to recover it after a 2-year legal battle. Their stories showed me I wasn't alone, that this type of family abuse was more common than I imagined. Together, we started organizing information sessions in the community. We invited Bob to come explain the rights of seniors, how to protect oneself against family abuse, what warning signs they should look for. The talks filled up with people. There was an enormous need for this information. I realized my painful experience could serve to help other people. I shared my story publicly for the first time in one of those talks. It was hard, I cried while speaking, but I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Several women approached afterward to thank me, to tell me my courage had inspired them. 6 months after the confrontation, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Ethan, my oldest grandson. He was only 8 years old, but his words were written with care. He told me he missed me, that he didn't completely understand why we didn't see each other, but that he knew adults sometimes had complicated problems. He sent me a drawing of my farmhouse with flowers all around. I cried reading that letter. My grandchildren had no fault in their parents' actions. They deserved to know their grandmother. I responded with a letter of my own, explaining in a way appropriate for his age that sometimes families go through difficult times, but that my love for him and his sister would never change. I started maintaining correspondence with my grandkids through letters. I didn't speak ill of their parents in those letters. I didn't burden them with the details of the betrayal. I just shared stories, sent them drawings, told them how much I loved them. It was a small but significant connection, a light in the middle of the pain. My life found a new rhythm. I spent most of the time at my farmhouse, enjoying the peace that had cost me so much to get. Occasionally I went to the city to visit some friends I had made in the church group. I had a simple but satisfying routine. I improved the garden, planted more flowers, created a small vegetable patch. Every morning I got up early, drank my coffee on the porch watching the sunrise, and gave thanks for having that place, for having had the strength to defend it. The farmhouse was no longer just a property. It was the symbol of my recovered dignity. 1 year after everything happened, Bob visited me with final news. The legal case had closed completely. Christopher and Jessica had complied with all terms of the agreement. They had a restraining order prohibiting them from approaching me or my property for 5 years. If they violated that order, they would immediately face criminal charges. I asked Bob how he felt about the result. He told me he was satisfied. We had managed to protect my assets, establish clear consequences for those who tried to take advantage of me, and create a precedent that could help others in similar situations. He told me I had been brave, that many people in my situation simply gave up. That night I sat on my sofa, the same sofa Christopher and Jessica had tried to haul away that terrible day. I looked around my living room, at the furniture I had chosen with care, at the photographs on the walls, at the curtains I myself had sewn. Everything was in its place. Everything was mine. No one had taken it from me. I thought about the road I had traveled. From a poor girl in a small town, passing through a struggling single mother, to an older woman who defended her dignity against her own family. Every stage had had its challenges, its pains, its lessons, but I had survived them all. I had remained standing. I understood something important that night. My value as a person never depended on how much money I had, or if my family appreciated me, or if I met the expectations of others. My value came from within, from the decisions I made every day, from the way I faced difficulties, from my capacity to maintain my integrity even when it was hard. At 68 years old, I had finally learned to put myself first without feeling guilt. I had learned that setting boundaries was not selfishness but survival. I had learned that true love never asks you to sacrifice your dignity or your security. If I could speak to other women my age who are going through similar situations, I would tell them this: it is never too late to defend yourself. No matter who the person trying to hurt you is, even if it is family, you have the right to protect what is yours. You have the right to live your last years in peace, with dignity, surrounded by people who genuinely value you. I would tell them to seek help, not to be afraid to speak, that there are professionals and communities willing to support them, that they document everything, that they trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right, that real family love never comes accompanied by manipulation or deceit. As the sun set that day, painting the sky with orange and violet colors over my farmhouse, I felt deeply grateful. I was alone, yes, but I was free. And for the first time in a long time, I was completely at peace.